Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to come from Jeremiah's 10th chapter. Now, the structural formula of this chapter is the first 16 verses are a cause. The 17th through 22nd verse are an effect. The cause of the effect is, in the first 16 verses, he explains the destructive folly of idolatry, and then the impending judgment which is to come is prophesied. And then the chapter concludes with the prayer to, if not eliminate the judgment, to lessen it, to treat them mercifully, because by every right and reason did they merit their destruction according to the terms of the covenant. And so he was pleading for Yahweh, interceding on the nation's behalf to not let them go extinct. And as things were, they were sent to captivity in Babylon, where their ethnic homogeny was preserved, and the remnant returned for the post-exilic period after a 70-year period. But the independent nation of Judah and Israel would be no more, at least until 1948. Now the opening verse reads, "Hear the word which Yahweh speaks to you, O house of Israel." Every word that Yahweh deigns to speak to humanity is very much for their benefit, ergo it demands listening and attention. "Thus said Yahweh, do not learn the ways of the Gentiles, and do not be frightened by the signs of the heavens, for the Gentiles are frightened by them." Now, in our diverse, multicultural, ethnically diverse, contemporary American culture, we are conditioned to assimilate the input of the various cultures which collectively form our nation, but we must rightly discard our multicultural conditioning in order to place ourselves in the admonition of this verse. Now, Israel was commanded to be separate from the nations because the other nations carried a contaminating spiritual effect with their polytheism and idolatry. So with good reason were they commanded to be separate from them. They were also commanded to evangelize them, but as the tragedy of the Old Testament reveals, the cultural impact of the adjacent civilizations infiltrated Judah and Israel to a greater extent than they influenced their neighbors. And the signs of the heavens, that is a reference to horoscopes, which is one means of discerning the future. Not entirely accurate, but the Gentiles were frightened by them. That's because they didn't know any better, but the Israelites who were supposed to know better, some of them seemingly didn't benefit from the message of the inferior source of prophesying the future and predicting the future. Now, the reasons for one might want to know the future are manifold. Namely, they can avoid disaster and to anticipate the dangers to come. And because they invested in an inferior foundation of a pagan practice of horoscopes, they could not alleviate the impending future judgment. "For the prescribed customs of these people are worthless. For one cuts a tree from the forest, work for the hands of a craftsman with a cutting tool." So their idols were metaphysically non-existent. The only reality or substance they had was the physical likeness according to which they were made. And more often than not, they were made in the likeness of animals or men, and their respective jurisdictions and domains encompassed an element of nature or a nation, a city-state, or a nationality. And their prescribed customs are described as worthless, and rightly so, because the only metaphysical substance in the idol is the wood itself, or the respective ornaments or natural elements which compose it. "They adorn it with silver and gold. They fasten it with nails and hammers, so that it does not topple. They are like a rounded post, and they do not speak. They have to be carried, because they do not walk. Do not be afraid of them, for they do no evil, nor is it in them to do any good." So they cannot speak, they cannot listen, they have all the physical appendages and body parts of human likenesses, yet they do not perform the functions or have the capacities of the various body parts. They are just essentially inanimate objects who cannot save, they cannot do good, they cannot do evil, they can inspire evil because the thought process behind them, and especially with the benefit in hindsight of revelation of the Almighty Creator of heaven and earth, it is evil to ignore that knowledge and to invest one's future in inferior idols. There is none like you, O Yahweh. You are great, and great is your name in might. So he's incomparable, and there's really no substitute. Now, an idol or a god is any source of satisfaction we seek to for our look to for our supreme source of satisfaction. But the satisfaction which Yahweh offers and can uniquely provide is alone and incorruptible and imperishable, whereas that of the earth and the idols is bound to corrupt and destined to perish. But there's really no substitute and no adequate comparison for what he can uniquely bring and provide. Who would not fear you, O King of the nations? For this is your due. For among all the wise men of the nations, and in all their kingdoms, there is none like you. Now the simplest worshipper of Yahweh is wiser than the most sophisticated worshipper of the inferior idols, and his sovereignty extends to not only the nations which worshipped him. At this point, Israel was the only nation which worshipped him, but the nations which had no knowledge or relationship with him, he still was very much invested in their welfare and created them not for quite the same purpose as Israel, but he used them to punish his chosen people, as we will read. They are both brutish and foolish. An instruction of worthlessness is the tree. So they have no positive, qualitative qualities. They're brutish and foolish. That means they're barbaric and unintelligent, and they're essentially worthless. Their only metaphysical substance is in the tree from which they are crafted. They contain no divine reality or substance outside, and no substance outside of the physical substance, yet they are erected for spiritual purposes, which, ironically enough, they are incompetent to provide. Silver is beaten into plates. It is brought from Tarshish, and gold from Euphaz, the work of the craftsman and of the hands of the smith, draped in blue and purple. All of them are the work of skilled ones. So there is a skill and a learning and a craft to idolatry, and it was a lucrative trade, and with good reason many of the early Christian inroads threatened the practice of idol makers, but this is several centuries after this, but the fact remains the same, that they were made of precious earthly objects, and they did require skill to make them, but they were ultimately a poor investment with no lasting substance or significance. But Yahweh is truly Elohim. He is the living Elohim and the everlasting King. At his wrath the earth shakes, and nations are unable to stand his displeasure. So all the idols and alternate erroneously conceived gods carried no power to wield the cosmic forces on earth to send a message, and he speaks to us in wrath, and he destroys in his wrath, and rightly so. He does extend multiple warnings and invitations to repent, but if we don't act on that, we merit the impending judgment, and several warnings always invariably precede the destructive judgment. And he is an everlasting king. That means he is without beginning and without end. And no nation, however powerful geopolitically they cannot withstand the divine power above them. Say to them this: the Elah that did not make the heavens and the earth shall perish from the earth and from under these heavens. So because they were the works of men and made in their image and after the image of animals, an inferior species, they were destined to perish. They are from the dust, and they shall return to the dust, whereas he who creates and controls all elements and natures alone is eternal. and worship in him is alone uniquely self-sufficient and efficacious. He has made the earth by his power. He has established the world by his wisdom, and has stretched out the heavens by his understanding. So the act of creation demanded a superabundance of intelligence. Now, Yahweh is an omniscient being, and more broadly speaking, Elohim is an omniscient being, meaning he is perfect in intelligence. And the creative process demanded a mind that was wise enough to design it and powerful enough to execute that design into action. So really the overlap of his infinite attributes of omniscience and omnipotence are very much at play, not only in the creation, but the sustaining of the natural world. When he makes his voice heard, there is a roaring of waters in the heavens, and he makes vapors rise from the ends of the earth. The lightnings for rain he has made, and brings wind from his treasuries. So all the elements and all the natures and all the natural disasters and calamities are very much under his jurisdiction, and he uses them according to send a message or to accomplish a wise design. And his voice is heard through the lightning. He speaks to us. Now, he speaks to us through his word, but when we don't listen, he speaks to us through his works, and that entails judgment and natural disasters. Everyone is brutish in knowledge. Every smith is put to shame by his idol, for his molded image is falsehood, and there is no spirit in them. So the knowledge of the intellectual foundation of idolatry is useless and is essentially nothingness in vain, and he who invests craftsmanship in the idols will be put to shame by them, because for this self-created, man-created God, they contain less power than the human that made them. They have no bodily capacities and no spiritual substance. And as he said, they are lies, they are not gods, they are not what their makers claim them to be, so they are images, falsehood, and there is no spirit in them. They have no spiritual sustenance or substance. They are worthless, a work of mockery. In the time of their punishment, they perish. So because they are worthless, they cannot withstand the judgment, and those who make them and invest in them and worship them are not spared of the judgment, but they are warned in advance of its occurrence. The portion of Jacob is not like these, for he is the maker of all, and Israel is the tribe of his inheritance. Yahweh of hosts is his name. So Jacob, that's a reference to Israel. Israel was the name that was given to Jacob, whose birth name was Jacob. And the nation that sprang from his loins, the 12 sons, collectively comprised the 12 tribes of Israel. And they were created for a unique purpose, and they had a unique relationship whereby they were on the receiving end of revelation from the almighty creator of heaven and earth, and they were designated here as the tribe of his inheritance. That means they had a special claim to his blessings and bounties, which they forfeited according to the terms of the covenant, which was a two-way street. Gather up your bundle from the ground, you who live under siege. So at this juncture in the narrative, remember I earlier mentioned the cause and the effect. So because he just spent the previous 16 verses describing the destructive folly and consequences of idol worship, and now they're on the receiving end of that which is to come, and he predicts it in advance of its occurrence. For thus said Yahweh, see, at this time I am hurling out the inhabitants of the land, and shall distress them, so they feel it. So there's no escaping. They will feel it. There's nothing they can do to alleviate that which is in motion. They reaped the cause and effect of reaping what they sow, and so they reaped idolatry. They would sow judgment, and rightly so. Woe to me for my breaking! My wound is grievous, but I say, this is my sickness, and I bear it. So here Jeremiah is interceding and speaking on behalf of the nation of Israel, and he is designated as the weeping prophet, and he shed many a tears, being privy to the destination and doom of his beloved nation. and this was his sickness. He had no choice but to bear it, because what doesn't kill us will only make us stronger. And his sickness wasn't fatal, but it was still very much unpleasant. My tent has been ravaged, and all my cords have been broken. My children have gone from me, and they are no more. There is no one to pitch my tent anymore, or to put up my curtains. This is the fate of a conquered people. Their children are scattered. Their families are no longer intact. Their home and shelters and permanent residence are no more. They are vagabonds and wanderers, and they have no protection from either the elements in the sky or the dominating nation, for the shepherds have become brutish, and they have not sought Yahweh. Therefore they did not understand, and all their flocks scattered. Now the Israelites were an agricultural people, and as such, shepherds or pastors carried a leadership connotation, be it secular or ecclesiastic. And in this context, he's referring to the priests who were designated as shepherds, and because they forsook their sacred calling and their divine mandate, as a result, the people under their jurisdiction, the laity, we'll call them, were led astray and scattered. And Ezekiel, in his 34th chapter, he condemns the qualities of the current state and the exile. Ezekiel writes in the exile, but the shepherds of Israel were not only neglecting their flock, but indulging at their expense. See, it has come, the voice of a report, and a great shaking out of the land of the north, to make the cities of Judah a waste, a habitation of jackals. Now the nation out of the north was Babylon, designated as an instrument or tool in the hand of Yahweh to punish or chastise his covenant nation according to the terms of the covenant. And of course, Babylon took this to the excess. They ravaged and were brutal in their conquering of this nation. And so Jeremiah is pleading for Yahweh to moderate what is inevitable and must come to pass. O Yahweh, I know the way of man is not in himself. It is not for a man who walks to direct his own steps. So the notion of one who is submitted to Yahweh is that they have no will save that which is subsumed to Yahweh's. And this is, of course, speaking in ideal terms. But the idea that man will not take a will, they will not act without consulting the Father in seeking out his will. And the way of man is not in himself. That means we think we're our own masters, but we are very often not. And no man is, there's no such thing as a self-sufficient or independently autonomous individual. It's all an illusion, because everything we can claim and benefit from in the earth belongs to its creator. O Yahweh, chastise me, but with justice, not in your displeasure, lest you bring me to naught. So Jeremiah is aware of the potential for a fatal judgment, and he's pleading for moderation. He knows that the judgment must come to pass, and as a citizen in good standing with Yahweh, he was the exception, yet he was not spared of the divine rebuke. He too had to be subjected by Babylonian conquest. Pour out your wrath on the Gentiles who do not know you, and on the tribes who do not call on your name. For they have eaten up Jacob, devoured him, and consumed him, and laid waste his home. This eventually would come to pass. Babylon, having served its purpose and abused its mandate, would be a perishable geopolitical entity, and they would be subsumed in the sands of empire to be displaced by the Medo-Persian, and then after them the Greco-Macedonian, and so the idea is that even those who are called for Yahweh's purpose, who do not know him and have a relationship with him, are very much subjected to how they act in accordance to the knowledge they know, however limited it be. They still have a conscience and are judged according to its dictates and the righteous exercise or lack thereof of. And that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. Tune in next time. Bye-bye.